Alright, so the purpose of this video lesson is to remind you what needs to go in a conclusion. So when you're at the point of writing a conclusion, at this point you should have already written your introduction. So this is probably the easiest part of the paper as long as your introduction followed the correct structure. So we know the conclusion is a mere opposite of the introduction. So while the introduction starts out really general and specific, the conclusion is going to flip, and it's going to start out really specific, first with your thesis being restated differently, and then it's slowly going to start to become more general, where you summarize your 3 points and then you refer back to your hook with a comment, question, or something else for your reader to think about. So for this lesson, I am going to use an introduction that I wrote earlier. This is an introduction for an essay prompt where I compare and contrasted the theme of two texts. For this essay prompt, I compared the theme of divergent and matched for each of my points in a separate theme, and for my third point, it was a theme they both shared. So I wrote an introduction about that. So I've already got my thesis written. I already know what my 3 points are, and I already had a hook. I chose to do a hook about the key idea of identity because that was a key idea. I really felt like I could connect all 3 of my points and my main characters too. So I'm going to go ahead and start out in my conclusion, and I've got my thesis, so I'm going to start with restating my thesis in a different way. So my original thesis was 1 to 2 sentences. Now when I'm starting this conclusion, I usually want to go ahead and reorder my points because that's going to help me state my thesis in a different way. So originally, my first point was the theme of divergent. My second point was the theme of match. My third point was the theme they both share. Now my third point was my third body paragraph. And so if you think about this, your conclusion comes after your third body paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and mention my third point first as a way to transition those 2 paragraphs. I would suggest you do the same thing and start with your third point. So let's see, my third point is the theme of both texts. So I'll say the theme of both texts is that each person should have the power to discover and choose their own identity. Now notice that I reworded that differently. Here was my original third point. The theme of both texts is one should have the right to choose their own path in life. And now here's my third point. Still means the same thing. I just kind of worded it a little bit differently, so I'm not stating it exactly the same. So now I need to go ahead and give my point 1 and my point 2. And so I should have probably color coded this for you. Sorry about that. So let's see if I can, I'm going to see if I can make this into one sentence to show good sentence variety. And if not, I'll just go to 2. The theme of both texts is that each person should have the power to discover, that should be discover, and choose their own identity, comma, while matched shows that society shouldn't control. Could I just say shouldn't control it? Because I was just talking about identity. It looks like I'm going to have to go ahead and do a second sentence. Divergent expresses the message. Instead of saying theme, I'm going to just change it up. That individuals don't just possess one trait. Which is essentially rewording my first point right there. So at this point in my conclusion, I'm starting out super specific and I'm slowly going to become more general. So I started here with restating my thesis differently. Now I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and summarize 3 points, kind of review them. So think back to the evidence that you presented in your body paragraphs and see how you might do that. So I could say, and I want to do this in order this time. So my first point was about divergent. So I could say Triss's society wanted her to choose one faction, comma, but her identity as divergent shows she is a complex being. So clearly this is a detail that I had picked in that body paragraph to show that first point. So that's my reviewing my first point. And I'm doing a very bad job at color coding, so I'm just going to continue with blue. Now I've got to go to my second point. And then I'll say Cassidy in matched. And here, society tried to like pick her husband, who she would married. So Cassidy and Match felt empowered to choose her own husband, comma, ultimately, discovering herself. So again, yeah, I'm reviewing my points, but I'm not using the same terminology as my thesis earlier. Clearly, I'm digging into some details that were given in my body paragraphs. And then lastly, I'm going to give my third point. Both texts show that all people control their own destiny. So that's my third point. So at this point, I want to get very general, and I'm going to refer back to my hook. And so my hook earlier was a quote about identity being your most valuable possession and you should protect it, and it was from Elastigirl. So at this point, I'm going to show the reader truly why I picked that. So I'm going to go a totally different color here. So I'll say something like, indeed, both Cassidy and Triss knew the value of protecting and harnessing their own identity. Notice how I'm really using some of the same words from my quote, but I'm not repeating my quote. My quote, my hook, had this idea of your identity being a possession and to protect it. So I've got this idea of protecting my identity. So I said Triss knew the value of protecting her identity. So I'm dropping in some of those keywords, but I'm not giving the exact same quote. I want to become more general. So now I'm going to make maybe a general comment, a general question, something that really leaves the reader something to think about there. So I could say, identity is perhaps the most valuable. The most valuable possession, comma, journey through life. So at this point, it's more like I'm talking to all people. My last sentence does not mention my book. It doesn't mention my titles. It doesn't mention my characters. It's just super general about this idea of identity. So I started with a quote of identity, and I'm ending with identity. So here I'm circling back to hook. So just to review, I've got my third point. The theme of both texts is that each person should have the power to discover and choose their own identity. I chose to talk about my third point first because I just finished proving that in the previous body paragraph. And then I also mentioned my third point again as I'm reviewing that key idea. I've got my second point where Matt shows that society shouldn't control identity. And so here I've mentioned my second point again with details that I kind of mentioned in my body paragraph. This is like a rainbow going on here. And then I've got my point about Divergent, which really was my first. It shows she is a complex being. So I am restating my thesis differently. I'm wrapping up my 3 points, thinking about the details I put in the body paragraph, and I'm circling back to my hook. So I'm starting out very specific and then slowly becoming more and more general. So now it's time for you to go back into your conclusion and make sure you do those things.